Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. Ryan is a family man, first and foremost, but he's also a pastor, publisher, and serial entrepreneur. This podcast will help you think, work, and create like never before.
Welcome to the Ryan Frank Podcast. This is Ryan Frank. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention. I'm excited about today's interview that I had with Christy Sawyer. You are going to be listening to a wonderful conversation where we talk about the grace-filled leader. You ever feel like you need grace? That's me. How about you? And there are a lot of people around you that need you to extend grace to them. If you've never met Christy Sawyer, she is a regular speaker at the Kids Matter Conference. Her husband, Jonathan, is our worship leader at the Kids Matter Conference. Christy is a pastor. She is an author of 3 books. She travels internationally and speaks, and she is a dear friend to Beth and I and our family and to the children's ministry community. I was grateful recently to sit down with her and talk to her about what does it mean to be a grace-filled leader? What does it really mean to receive grace and extend grace? And what we're going to discover in this conversation is that it really makes a difference and an impact when you have to have difficult conversations as a leader, when you have to make tough decisions, as you try to grow and empower a team, and so much more. I'm very, very grateful that you've tuned in today. If you're listening to the podcast, I want to remind you that there is a YouTube version of the podcast. If you are watching the YouTube version, I want to remind you that there is an audio version of the podcast. You can find all of the links over at ryanfrank.com. Christy is going to be joining us again this year at the Kids Matter Conference. I hope that you have your tickets and that you are planning on bringing your team. The Kids Matter Conference is the premier event for children's ministry leaders and their teams. It's happening September 12th, 13th, and 14th in Nashville, Tennessee. We'd love to have you there. Now, without further ado, let's get this show on the road. Here is my interview with Christy Sawyer. Hey, Christy, thanks for joining me on the podcast. How you doing?
I'm doing great. It's such an honor. I was thrilled when you asked. Anytime with you guys is great.
It's awesome. And we were saying right before we pushed record that we need to spend more time together. We see each other. We used to see each other some in Fort Myers, but now it's just every year at the Kids Matter Conference, and we need to schedule some times in between to hang out. So as I shared, we're going to do it. We need to do it. As I shared in the intro, Christy is a dear friend of the family and a great friend of the Kidmin community. We appreciate you coming and ministering every year at the Kids Matter Conference, along with your husband, Jonathan. We think the world of both of you. Christy, if somebody's watching or listening, maybe they're not familiar with you or they haven't heard you speak at the conference, would you take a few minutes and just introduce who is Christy Sawyer? Maybe tell us your journey, your spiritual journey, and even your ministry journey. We'd love just to get to know you more.
Absolutely. I am the story of the least likely that would be in ministry. If you had told me in my younger days that I would be ministering, I would have run for dear life.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. I was raised in the church. I was actually put up for adoption as a baby, and I ended up in a family where my grandfather was the pastor of a church, but it was very I hate to overuse the word legalistic, but that is what it was. And I could not recognize or get close to the Jesus that I heard about all my life growing up, although I wouldn't exchange that experience for the world because it surely did build a foundation. So I was on a journey of identity. Who am I? Not feeling good enough. And because of that, made tons of mistakes. I've written a book called Held in the Grip of Grace that is actually a kind of a little bits of my testimony that led me on this journey. What I say all the time is God will use any means to get you where he wants you to get to, no matter what.
Yes.
So as a result of that, fast forward on that journey, I kind of came to the end of myself, which is a great place to be.
Hmm.
And he called me to preach and speak and write. And I have a real passion for people who especially have been hurt in church because they've not been introduced to the real authentic Jesus.
Yes.
I'm very passionate about women who cannot find their place,
Mhm.
and broken people in general, and really empowering men and women to step out, because I do believe our time is short,
Mm.
to get out and do what God has called us to do.
Yeah. So you grew up in this church that sounds like maybe a little more rule focused, maybe legalistic, which I know I can resonate with that to a degree. And I'm sure a lot
Mhm.
of our listeners can. At what point did you really sense God calling you to ministry?
Interestingly, I was in my, growing up, I always felt I had this sense of being, this is silly, but being an alien. I really thought somebody was going to tell me at some point that I was an alien from another planet. And I think that had to do with just the whole identity thing and being adopted and not finding my place.
Hmm.
But looking at it from this side, I almost feel like there was a leading that I had been set apart, that there was a set apartness about me. And I was in my 20s sitting in a church, and for the first time in my life I heard a woman preacher, and it has nothing to do with her being a woman.
Yes.
But for the first time in my life, I heard a testimony given from the pulpit,
Mm.
where a testimony was woven into a message,
Yeah.
and it was with such authenticity and honesty. And she was actually speaking of her mistakes. But I'm looking at this woman and I'm thinking, wow, if God kind of brought her from where he brought her from, and she is actually ministering, it was like that was the beginning of something started waking up in me. And I think that was the first time I ever considered that God had set me apart and had something for me to do for
Mm.
his kingdom.
Mm. I love that.
Mhm.
So you are in your 20s. You
Mhm.
sense God calling you to ministry. Then what?
Well, he calling me to ministry, but I was still on the journey of trying to figure out who I was.
Yeah.
And through a series of trying to find that place, that there was a void because I
Yeah.
didn't ever feel like I belonged.
Yes.
So through a series of trying to find love in all the wrong places,
Yeah.
with friends growing up, just relationships in school, to trying to be perfect and having the perfect grades, to excelling in sports, to trying to always get the approval of my parents, and then in relationships with men, just broken relationships, abusive relationships,
Yeah.
and having zero self-worth. And so I went through
Mm.
this series of years of this journey. I mean, even ended up in a hospital because of an eating disorder, because my life was so chaotic.
Yes.
And it was probably, I don't know, I was probably 25, 26 years old, where it was like I was in a corner and there was nowhere else I could go. And I really had a Samaritan woman experience, a woman at the well experience,
Mhm.
where it's kind of a 50-50 woman at the well experience and a woman with the issue of blood experience, because
Mhm.
I know that Jesus was waiting for me on
Mm.
the edge of my well. He was waiting to give me this living water. And because he wanted me to go into the city and tell everybody about what he had done. But at the same time, I also had the experience of, I was that woman who had to finally come to the end of myself and dive underneath people's legs and move people out of the way to get to him, because I really felt if I could just get to the hem of his garment, then something would change. So if you can interweave those stories together, that's sort of the experience I had. And it was like he said, I'm going to make a deal with you.
Mm.
If you will give me everything, all of it, the bad, the good, the ugly, and if you will do with it what I tell you to do, A, I'm going to heal it. B, I'm going to make it into something beautiful. I'm not going to waste one piece of it. And even the parts you'd rather people not know, you're going to have to be obedient enough to when I tell you to speak it, I need you to speak it, because people are going to get freedom from it. And I didn't even understand the magnitude of that, but I was so desperate for things to be better that
Yes.
I was willing to sign up for anything he said, not knowing what that was actually going to look like.
Mm. Mm. What a neat story. And here you are today, still thankful for God. We're going to talk about being grace-filled, because I know you're passionate about that word grace and
Yes.
receiving God's grace, extending God's grace, living in that grace. And here you are looking back and thankful for God's grace in your life, still leaning on that grace today, as we all are. And tell us, what does the ministry or what does your ministry look like today? You know, we've talked about the fact that you join us each year, Christy, at the Kids Matter conference, but God is growing your platform to help others with books, speaking. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I started a ministry back in 2017 called River Dwellers, which is actually a discipleship ministry for women.
Yes.
And it's funny because I'm not a women's ministry kind of person. And in fact, if I had my choice, I would minister to a mixed audience, but he has a sense of humor.
Yep.
So I started this ministry, and it really reaches women from it is not denominational.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's about going and making disciples. And it's really about us going out and touching the untouchables. So on any given service or conference or a retreat or whatever, you may have atheists, you may have Nazarene, Baptist, Catholic, former strippers or current strippers, drug addicts, divorced women. It really is about healing the broken and helping lead them from being what they consider an outcast or a misfit into being a true disciple. So currently we have 4 locations in Texas, Florida, the Great Lakes, and in Tennessee, meeting far-reaching. And that's I'm the director of that, but I also have a pretty strong speaking ministry and get invited internationally to speak at pastors' conferences, women's conferences, children's conferences. That was my first one,
Yep.
which I love so much.
And it's your favorite now, isn't it?
Can I just stop for 1 second and
I'm just
plug you
teasing.
for 1 second?
Yes.
No, for real. When I was at this last one and I did all those breakout sessions, I was looking back over my year. I had the best time that day. It was like I could use the word fun. It was so much fun speaking into these people's lives. So yeah, so
and we wore you out. We kept you busy, didn't we?
You wore me plumb out, but it was worth it. And I've made some great relationships from that. So I'm so thankful. But yes, so he's allowed me to write a couple books. So I travel quite a bit, and it's exciting.
You need to follow Christy on social media. Go to her website, Christy Sawyer Ministries.com or .org. I forget.
Great one. Com. It's com.com.
Yes. Christy Sawyer Ministries.com. We'll put the link to that in the show notes. Christy, let's talk about grace. You've written this book, Held in the Grip of Grace. We have a lot of leaders that are watching or listening to the podcast today. Many of them are ministry leaders, some are business leaders. When you think about leadership, what is grace? How would you define grace? What does grace look like for the leader?
I think it's understanding that the people that you're leading should be considered contributors to what it is that you're doing. God led them to the ministry that you're leading on purpose. So we need to look at them as contributors. And the other part of that is leading with grace is meeting people where they are.
Yes.
Jesus always met people where they are. So, we are all human and we all go through different things. And I just told some of my story, but all of those pieces have been necessary for where God has wanted me to go. And likewise, the people that you're leading as well. So we need to meet them where they are. But then because we are leaders, we need to help them get back to center, which is always back to Jesus. So I think that's been one of the biggest tools for me in leading with grace is helping to meet them where they are, but helping to lead them back to center.
I love that. And you started by saying, recognizing, when I asked that question, your first point was seeing people. How did you word that?
That they are contributors, that
Contributors.
they
That's
have
right.
something to bring to the table,
As opposed to,
as
um,
opposed to me being it all being have to be my idea, it has to
yes,
be everything that I say, this is the way it is. But understanding and realizing that God has put us all in this together and that they have something to contribute.
I love that. And we probably both have been a part of organizations that are more leader focused, where the leader has to get the credit for everything and has to have all the bright ideas. And the people, whether it's staff or the people, the congregation, whatever, they are almost, I don't know if tools is the right word, but, or I don't know what the right word is, but we get, as opposed to God has brought these people and he has gifted them
Mhm.
and they play a key role and a contribution, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about, what would you say what role does grace play in creating a healthy culture or work environment? A lot of those listening to the podcast are working with others in some capacity, many leaders, pastors. What role does grace play in a work environment?
Huge, because I think that when there's grace present, then with that comes appreciation,
Okay.
showing appreciation for the environment that you're doing ministry or the work environment. And this is not just for church environment, this is for leaders and business and marketplace,
Yeah.
schools, everywhere. But when we lead with grace, then that will help foster an environment where there's an appreciation for what each person brings to the table. We talked about them being contributors,
Yeah.
which then helps a person feel valued.
Yes.
There are people like me who grew up and could never find their value.
Yeah.
So just leading with grace can be the difference between a person understanding their value. And then when someone feels valued, you don't ever have to be a slave driver to get them to produce and get things out of it.
That's a
They
good
want
point.
to.
That's a
They
good point.
want to do their very best because they see that that's linked to, I mean, they are valued.
Yes.
So I think that leading by grace it can change an environment
Mhm.
completely.
Yeah. And I love that about appreciation, because I think if there's anything that we ought to exceed at as leaders, it is being a cheerleader for the people that we work with,
Yeah.
showing appreciation. I know that if you're watching or listening and you're a leader of people, I'm sure that you appreciate your volunteers. I'm sure you appreciate your team, but you've got to express that appreciation, don't you, Christy?
You
Um,
absolutely do.
whether it's picking up the phone and calling someone, sending them a card in the mail, some tangible way to express that appreciation. Make sure you're expressing it, I think, is my point, because I'm sure you do appreciate those people.
It's real easy to take it for granted,
It
especially
is.
the ones that, I forget what the percentages are. You probably know. And when you're talking about volunteers, the actual percentage of how many people volunteer in a church, and it seems to be the same ones over and over. And a lot of times
Yes.
it's easy to take that for granted,
Yes.
that they just always show up.
Yes.
But, if something happens in their lives that goes wrong in their family, you know, and we're just taking that for granted. I mean, it does not create a great work environment or volunteer environment. And I think another thing that also helps to create a positive environment is when we as leaders show vulnerability, because
100%.
when we're honest and authentic, it makes us so relatable. And it really, that has been a huge um, uh,
Yeah.
light bulb for me, is being
Yeah.
vulnerable, being willing to be vulnerable with the people that I lead.
Yes. People respond to that, don't they?
They do.
I remember when I was in seminary, we went to a Baptist church down in Pensacola, Florida, and we went on a midweek, and the pastor got up to do his Bible study. And in the middle of his lesson, he told this joke, and the joke ended with, he used the word jackass in the joke and went on. But then I didn't think a whole lot about it. People laughed. My next Wednesday, we came back, and at the end of his lesson, he said, I need to talk to y'all about something. And he said, I need to, and he started to tear up. And he said, last Wednesday night, I told a joke, and, I used the word jackass. And he said, I shouldn't have done that. That offended some people. I shouldn't have used that word, and I need to ask for your forgiveness. And, that, and to a kid in seminary, that really spoke volume, because so many of us would just blow over. Okay, a couple people got offended. I used the word jackass. Let's move on. But the fact that he was humble and vulnerable and was willing to be real and ask for forgiveness, and some of the people of the church got around him and prayed and told him that they loved him. God blesses that, doesn't he, Christy?
He does.
Being vulnerable and real.
He really does. Well, that's how we're raising and teaching. I mean, that's what we need to be teaching, especially this next generation coming up. I mean, there's such an element of humility, that in being surrendered, humility, being dependent on Jesus. It's when I travel from place to place, there's an absence, a huge absence of that humility.
Yes. The scriptures, pretty clear that God resists the proud, right? Gives grace to the humble. But I don't know why, Christy, as leaders, I don't know, you see it like I do. You work with pastors and ministry leaders every day like I do. And it seems like God starts blessing someone's ministry, and all of a sudden there's a temptation to get a big head and get a God complex and think it's all about me. But boy, that's a dangerous spot to be in. Wouldn't you agree?
Very dangerous. And you have to ask the question, I'm very thankful. I mean, I'm never that person. When somebody asks me to speak somewhere and, they want to have a meal before, or they want to get together, and it's like, I don't even understand how people can even think straight before they're getting ready to go and minister, because it's such a huge responsibility. I say all that to say, I hate that, because I feel sometimes I get envious of other people who it's like, it's no big deal, it's just nothing. But God always keeps me humble, because I know that unless he's in it, then I can't do there. I have no ability to do this by myself. And so I think a lot of that has to do with remembering who he is and remembering who we are, and that we're vessels being used. But I have seen ministry after ministry turn into something watered down or even perverted, because the wrong spirit is behind it. And I would not want to be accountable for that. I would not want to be accountable for that.
100%. Okay, so I want to stick with this theme of the grace focused leader. Great, the fact that we all need grace. We need it. We need to extend it. And let's get practical into the weeds in a few areas, Christy, that leaders face or deal with every day. Let's talk about difficult discussions or difficult conversations. If you're a leader, you're going to have some pleasant conversations, and you're also going to have some difficult, challenging conversations, right? How does grace, any tips for showing grace? What does grace look like in difficult conversations? Thoughts?
I have lots of experience with that.
Yep.
I think one of the first things is not avoiding it. And I think the church is it famous or infamous?
Yes.
But sometimes, I'm not saying that church always has to be handled like a business, but sometimes we don't steward things well, and we do it all under the the title of it's a church, we don't, so we can overdo it. So one of the things I think biggest disservices we can do as leaders when it's time to have a difficult conversation is to avoid it, to put it under the rug, because sweep it under the rug, because it does no one any good.
Yep.
It will eventually come back around, and it's going to look much uglier when it does. So I
Yes.
think that's number one. And then once
Definitely.
we have the conversation and be direct, is that we need to learn to listen, and we listen to understand. So regardless of what the content of that conversation or the circumstances, we as leaders, we need to have discernment, and we need to listen to understand what's being said. And then we need to affirm, regardless of where they're coming from, we need to affirm what it is that's being said. And then we, with grace, have the right and the obligation to then explain our position.
Yes.
Because God has called us into a leadership position for a reason. So we've been called to drive the ship. So we have an accountability for this position that we carry. So we have the right and the obligation then to explain our position. And then we need to come to the conclusions of it in love, because everything has to be done in love. So
good. I think for a lot of us, it's easy to jump right to that third point of explaining our position and forgetting about the listening and understanding. And it's almost like we listen to formulate a response instead of listening. At least I do. I'm guilty of this. I begin formulating a response immediately as they start to talk, instead of genuinely listening with grace, affirming what they say. Being humble and self-aware enough to hey, take maybe I can learn from this, but I'm going to explain it in love, speaking the truth in love. Boy, I love that, Christy. Anything else you want to add to that?
When you follow that formula, you end up diffusing, because people are not expecting that. Everybody usually comes ready to fight, and
that's true.
Fight's a strong word, but
that's true.
We want to be right.
We want to win. Yes.
But we want to win. So it's a great formula to follow, and it will diffuse the situation. And, to be honest with you, there are some things I need to listen to. I mean, I need to learn from this myself. So it's a good formula, and it will diffuse the situation.
And I have found that in ministry and working with people, a lot of times people just want to be heard. They don't necessarily even I don't know that they want it to get resolved. Maybe they do, as much as they just want to know that you hear them out, that you really hear them. And so, boy, I think if you can cultivate that skill of listening with grace, really understanding, affirming what someone says, that alone is going to solve 90% of difficult conversations. And being humble and assuming, like Jesus, the position of a servant, that I'm just going to humbly listen and love through this. And you know what? I'm the pastor, I'm the leader. But I don't have to have all the answers and be the fixer. What about in this area? That was great. So where grace plays a role in difficult conversations, what about in difficult choices that need to be made and tough decisions? As leaders, we all have decisions to make. Some are easy, some are challenging. Christy, do you believe grace plays a role even in our decisions we have to make as leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. Because there are always going to be tough decisions. And so again, you have to, I think when there's a tough decision to be made, again, we want it to be covered in love. But I think also sometimes that expression, covered in love, can be almost, it's almost like that word hyper grace. It can also be abused. So we have to remember as leaders who we are and the role that we've been called to. And so when we're leading, part of leading is setting boundaries for people, for the ministry, for what we're doing. We've been called to do that. So when we have a difficult situation, difficult decisions, we have to take into consideration that it's not just about me. It's not just about even me and a couple people. It's about a whole group of people. So part of that is setting the very best boundaries, and people like boundaries, whether they want to admit that they do or not. Boundaries make us safe. The Bible gives us boundaries. Jesus gave boundaries. So with love, being willing to make the hard decisions to that maybe you won't have the popular vote on, but because we have taken it to the Lord and, have heard from him, sometimes we'll have to make those difficult decisions and set those boundaries. So we have to understand the role that we are supposed to play, and we're not going to always be the mayor, the most popular, the one that gets the most votes. And people will, even if if you have 100 people and you're getting ready to make a difficult decision that has to deal with all of these people, you're going to have some that believe one thing and some that agree another way. So even when you have to make a decision that not everybody's going to agree on, in the long run, if you have gotten that answer from God, they will end up all respecting and honoring that decision, and
they will
being thankful for it down the road. So I think that for me, and I've had to make some difficult decisions in ministry, even in the last few months, that it was for the whole, not just for this person or for this person, but for the whole, and to think I'm passing a baton down the road. So I have to think about generations to come in the decisions that I make. So it's not going to make me the most popular always.
No, you think, and that's so good, Christy. Thank you. And I wholeheartedly agree. This isn't always easy for pastors, is it? I think pastors in particular, because most people that are pastors, they're just so people oriented. And, a lot of times pastors, I think, get accused of people pleasing and so on, but in some of them they might, but I think at the end of the day, it's just their heart that pastors love people. They're shepherds of people. And, the idea of making a decision that 20% of the people may not like, that is hard on a lot of pastors that just love everybody. And it's not necessarily that they want to please everybody. They just love everybody. What would you say to someone that just is such a pastor, has such a pastor's heart, that the idea of making a monumental decision that 20% of the people or whatever percentage of the people aren't going to like kills them? What would you say to that person?
I understand.
Yes.
We've all been there. It's very, very hard. I think we have to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and keep our eyes fixed on the building of his kingdom.
Yes.
And we have been called to leadership for a reason.
Yes.
Because we have to make those tough decisions. And so it's almost like when Jesus left the 99 to go get the one, I wonder what the 99 were thinking when he left.
That's a good point.
We have to be spirit led, which is not always going to make sense in the natural to people, but we have to trust that he will give us the confirmation and the affirmation that we need, that will keep us hung up in popular, unpopular opinion. And it's just not easy, but the more we do it, this I can say from experience, and you probably can too.
Yeah.
We always are going to love the people, but the more we have to step out and make those decisions, I hate to say the easier it gets, but the more we understand the role that God has given us.
Christy, I love that. Let's move to another practical area. Are you tracking with me? I'm
tracking.
Good. Okay. We froze there for about 5 seconds. At least I did on my end, but we're good. I'm connected with you. So Grace, what about in this area? And maybe we'll wrap up with this one before we move to our final two questions. So something I talk about a lot on the podcast and with leaders is building your team, growing a team. You've got to have people coming behind you. You got to have people beside you. What role does Grace play in the life of a leader that wants to grow and empower a team? Thoughts?
Mm. I think that where the difference when grace is missing,
Mm-hmm.
when it's lacking, I'll start there, then we're not able to, that whole thing of surrounding yourself with people who are smarter and better than you
Yes.
are.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. If you don't have grace, if you're leading without grace, then you're not able to do that because
Mm-hmm.
you're too busy trying to make your own way and it be about your name and be about you. That's not team building.
Mm-hmm.
So building a team and encouraging, the best way to build a team is to look for those people who have, and grace allows that to bring people in who have strengths where you don't.
Yes.
And build your team that way, because it takes all the different personality types and all the different giftings to do that. And again, I have to keep going back to the same thing of, we have to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus and surrender to him and his mission. And I know that sounds so churchy and it gets old saying it probably to some people, but when we are looking at what it is he is trying to create, and when we're listening to him, then we will be able to identify the people that need to be on that team. And we're not going to feel like we have to get all the credit for it and that kind of thing. So I think grace plays a huge role in collaboration and creativity, because it's allowing everybody to come together and brainstorm without it having to be about ownership and being territorial. I've seen enough people building kingdoms in churches, building their own kingdoms, and then we lose sight of building his kingdom. So I think another principle in when you bring grace to leadership, this is a huge one for pastors or leaders of ministry, is if we want to grow that, we have to be willing to release people. So when people identify something God's called them to do, his kingdom's upside down. When we release people into what he's called, we're so afraid. We feel like we have to hold people close. But the more we release people into what he's called them to do, he replaces that like tenfold. So when we can really celebrate, that's another one, is celebrating people and what God is doing in their lives, then our team just gets bigger and bigger. Our congregations get bigger and bigger. Our ministries get bigger and bigger. Our reach gets bigger and bigger. But it's when we release them into what God calls them to do, then it gets easier and easier for it not to be about this territorialism. So we truly quit building his kingdom, just knock those walls down and start building Jesus's kingdom.
Yeah, that's such a game changer that I wish every leader in the church could hear and really understand and grasp. So podcast listeners, be committed to being a grace-filled leader.
Yeah.
Boy, grace-filled leaders, Christy, I think are so much more attractive too. I mean, if you think about building a team, people are much more apt to want to be on the team of a grace-filled leader, that it's not all about me. It's not all about me getting the credit. It's not all about me and my ideas, but it's just about humbly serving each other. People are attracted to that. Wouldn't you agree?
It is. It's contagious. It's attractive. It's like a magnet. It makes you want to be around that person and be a part of what they're doing. Yeah.
Yes. Christy, before I come to I always like to end the podcast by asking two questions, but before we get into those two questions, at the beginning, briefly, we talked about your book, In the Grip of Grace. Why that book, and will you just kind of unpack it? What are some of the things that you talk about in that book, and then tell us where we can get it?
Held in the Grip of Grace.
Yes.
You can get it from my website, ChristySawyerMinistries.com. You can also get it from pathwaypress.org. I did not want to write that book. A publisher came to me and asked me to write the book. He had heard me speak and heard me talk about my testimony. And he said, what I want you to do is take bits of your testimony. It's not like a life story, but take pieces of it and tie it into the word and show the victory in it, where people can even almost use it as a Bible study, but it would be encouragement. So I actually went away and I wrote the book in about 2 weeks. It was the
Wow.
most miserable experience of my life. Not really. There's been many more.
Did you
than
write
that.
the book in 2 weeks?
I tried, I could not, I just couldn't do it. I actually
Okay.
wrote a chapter, sent it to my kids. And the only one that was truly honest, it was like, this is terrible. You need to throw it away, Mom.
Yeah.
So I went away and I did in 14 days, sat down,
Wow.
I was all by myself and I wrote this book.
Wow.
And it really hits areas like divorce, poverty, addiction, mental illness, church hurt, discipleship, just all of these different areas, being rejected. And it shows resolution in it with scripture. It's very personal, but we have had amazing testimonies from people, and people use it as Bible studies. It truly was the Lord. There's no way I could have done that. But yeah, held in the grip of grace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Beth has read the book. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. I need to read the book. I feel like I read it as Beth read it because she was giving me the cliff notes at the end of every chapter. So it's a wonderful book. I know a lot of you that have attended our conference have grabbed that book and been helped by it. Thank you, Christy. Okay, last 2 questions. Number 1, I'd love to hear from you. What is your favorite Bible story and why? And that's not always an easy question because, boy, there's so many good Bible stories.
It isn't. It's like saying, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite song?
Yes.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier obvious ones, the Samaritan woman and the woman with the issue of blood, because both of those stories, resonate with me so much. If I'm for today, my favorite Bible story is, I've been on a quest of educating ministries and churches and congregations on discipleship, because I really do think it's an element that is missing in our churches. It's one of those Christian words that go in one ear, out the other ear. So I did a whole message and it's called Jesus Said, Leave Her Alone. And it's based on Mary of Bethany. And I think, there's a couple of accounts of Mary of Bethany, but I think she's one of my favorites right now because she was willing to press through religious barriers and social barriers, cultural barriers, because she was so desperate to get at the feet of Jesus. And her story is one of, it didn't matter what because everybody rebuked her. Her sister rebuked her, the disciples rebuked her, the religious people rebuked her, but she didn't care. She wanted to get at the feet of Jesus. And that is the true definition of being a disciple, is sitting at the feet of Jesus to teach other people how to sit at the feet of Jesus. And the Bible says she poured everything she had out. And that goes back to my story of where I have hurt people, how I have hurt, all my sin, all of my mistakes, all my victories, all of my hurts, all of my hangups. She poured it all out. It was the most expensive thing she ever did. And that's my story. It has cost me everything. To follow Jesus is free. To be saved is free.
Yes.
But to be a disciple, true, authentic disciple of Jesus, will cost you everything that you have. So I would have to say the story of Mary of Bethany. Jesus said to everybody, leave her alone.
Leave her alone. Leave her alone. I love that. And what is something, here's my question number 2, and we'll wrap up with this one. Something big that Christy Sawyer is working on right now.
Well, I started a podcast about a month ago.
I saw that. Congrats.
Yeah. Thank you. And to be honest with you, I had never even listened to a podcast before, but I had some people really pushing me. And then there was like a final confirmation. And so it's called Making Waves. I think there are 5 episodes out so far. I'm going to officially on here invite you to be a guest.
I would love that.
So now you have to.
I would love it. Yes.
This is out of my comfort zone. This is harder for me than speaking to thousands of people. So this is out of my comfort zone to do this. But it has been very impactful, and I'm wanting to hit the the subjects that people are not talking about, that the church is not talking about, to really bring clarity and healing. So that's one thing. And then I am this year, my goal, I am planning to write another 365-day devotion book that I have begun the framework for. So I'm hoping to have that maybe towards the middle of the summer, end of summer.
Nice. So, okay. So let's go back to number one quick. The Making Waves, not
Called
waves,
Making Waves.
W-A-V-E-S, Waves podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And you're hitting topics like, just give us a few.
Mental illness. Why is there such a gap between mental illness and the church?
Wow.
What the church doing something about it? Things like depression. I just did one on infidelity, where there was porn addiction and multiple adulterous affairs, and how they got victory from this. Dealing with homosexuality, all the tough ones.
That's good. Are you interviewing people on this podcast? Is it you teaching on these topics? What's your approach?
It's mostly interviewing. There are going to be some, like I just did a standalone one, actually called Jesus Said Leave Her Alone, which is about discipleship. But the majority will be interviews, but there will be some standalone just talking about topics.
I love it. It's the Making Waves podcast. Great job, Christy, for tackling that. And keep with it. I know you'll do a wonderful job. Then a 365-day devotional. You think it'll be ready for the Kids Matter conference in September?
I hope so. I'm a little behind. I have another one called Arise, My Love. It's a 365-day devotional.
Okay.
And that continues to be one of my biggest sellers because it's bite-sized and it's a great tool to give to unbelievers, just a little bit of something. So I do think I will have it ready. I'm saying it in faith. So
in faith, speak it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speak it.
Yeah.
It's Christy Sawyer, Christy Sawyer Ministries.org.com.
Yes.
ChristySawyerMinistries.com. The link's in the show notes. Go check out our books. Go check out our new podcast. And if you've not met Christy in person, she will be, Lord willing, her and her husband, Jonathan, at the Kids Matter conference this fall. So, we've kind of unofficially signed you guys on, like between now and whenever Jesus comes back, you're coming back to the Kids Matter conference every fall, right?
Heard him say it. You heard him say it.
Yes.
Yes. We love it. Love it.
We love having you there. We love your ministry and your family and everything that you do. Christy, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today. It's been an amazing conversation. Thanks for inspiring and challenging the church to walk with him and live by grace. You're making a huge difference. I know God has wonderful things coming your way. So keep following him every day. Thanks for joining us, Christy.
Thank you, Ryan. We love you guys.
This episode of the Ryan Frank podcast has ended, but be sure to subscribe for more conversations to help you stay on the leading edge. And if you like what you've heard, please rate this podcast with 5 stars. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you next time.